Hi fellow book lovers and welcome back to my channel. I cannot believe another month of the year is done and dusted. This of course means I am wrapping up July. I read 10 books. I'm going to be reviewing them all here. There were two books that really surprised me. That'll be sort of at the end of the video because I am doing this from lowest to highest ranked. There will be chapters, so if you do feel the need to skip ahead and pick and choose which reviews you listen to, totally fine. Without further ado, let's get into it. I have a simple oat milk latte from my local cafe. Grab your drink and we'll get started. The first book I'd like to discuss is Fyneshade by Griffin. I gave this 3 stars. This was my lowest ranked book of the month. I listened to this on audiobook. It is a historical fiction novel set in Victorian England, and we follow Marta, who has dealings with witchcraft. She basically believes her destiny lies within the walls of Fyneshade, and it is this beautiful Gothic manor. She goes there as a governess to Grace Pritchard, who is non-verbal. Eventually, we do learn that Marta is essentially there for Grace's brother, Vaughan Pritchard. There's a lot of mystery here. We have the lord of the house missing. We don't know where he is. We learn that Vaughan cannot enter Fyneshade, and we're not sure why. As I said, Grace is non-verbal. She moves about the house in quite mysterious ways. So even though it's historical fiction, there is like an element of paranormal activity, not in like the scariest sense, but more just like an eerie feel to the whole book. Marta's quite a difficult character to stomach. She is quite devious and she will do anything to get what she wants. The treatment of Grace by Marta is something I think I struggled with a little bit. So it is quite difficult to root for her. But oddly, as the events unfolded, and I think because so many characters aren't good in this book, you do start to root for her, which brings up some interesting questions about morals. I can see how when you're reading this, maybe it would feel quite slow because I did find it a slower pace, but because I was listening to it on audiobook, where you can plug in and do something else while you listen, it didn't really bother me too much. I will also say that the final hour of this really ramps up. I was driving home and literally gripping my steering wheel because there was just so many like revelations one after the other. I liked the occult elements of it. I also loved how like gothic the house and the setting was. It is beautifully written as well, and I think especially the narration for this was really good. My only gripe with it was the relationship or dynamic between Grace and Marta, but I can totally see why that was necessary to the story. And I do have a historical setting. It's usually in a fantasy or sci-fi book apart from Greek retelling. So I think this one is a little bit too like straight up historical fiction for me, and then I didn't feel like a lot was happening. But I will say there was that sort of murder mystery element, and like I said, a lot of questions that needed answering. So yeah, not a bad book by any measure. I think if you enjoy Gothic settings, especially in historical fiction, this will be one that you will likely enjoy. Next was Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, and I gave this 3.25. This was by far my most disappointing read of July and perhaps the entire year so far. I think when a story is kind of tagged and marketed as Medusa's story and then doesn't really deliver on a whole lot of Medusa, it automatically just disappoints. I really enjoy underdog stories, and I love when a vilified character is taken and given some justice, that their story is really dug into and given a little bit more dimension. And that's what I was expecting going into Stoneblind. Unfortunately, it just didn't really do that. We had very little time with Medusa, given that this is meant to be a Medusa story. We had multiple POVs, and I completely understand why this was necessary to the story, because we had to set up those players to kind of come together in that culmination of Medusa's story. So we were following the Greek gods, especially Athena, to see why she made the decisions that she did and why she cursed Medusa. Then we were also following Perseus because, of course, Perseus is integral to the story. Usually when it is a Medusa story, it almost becomes a Perseus story because he is the great hero in the story. And I think what Natalie Haynes was doing was showing that Perseus wasn't a great hero. In fact, he was a bit of a bumbling idiot who didn't need to do what he did. But I think in doing that, even though she tried to show him in quite a negative light, there was still so much attention on him that it still felt more like a Perseus story, and it still made Medusa feel like an insignificant character in her own story. The other thing I disliked about this was showing us that the gods are very petty and almost childlike, made it feel like a parody of Greek gods, which in itself is fine. And again, I understand the reasoning behind making that move. But what it did was it made it feel like it wasn't taking the story, which is quite a tragic and disturbing story, seriously enough. It just felt like it was kind of making fun of the entire story. This is so well written. There were scenes, especially between Perseus, Athena, and Artemis, that had like a really funny dynamic and had me chuckling along. So it wasn't that I completely hated this book. I think it was just my expectation was up here and what the book executed was maybe over here. I did buddy read this with two friends, and this was very much a Goldilocks situation because I really didn't like it. Another friend of mine was sort of meh about it. She liked some elements, didn't like other elements. And then we had a friend who did really enjoy this and made a really good point in saying this would be a good introduction to Greek mythology. And I really agree with that because this introduces some key figures in Greek mythology. So I think this would probably be a really nice entry point into the genre if you are interested in that. The next thing I read was Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim, and I gave this 3.75. I went into reading this with a little bit of dread because I had seen a lot of people say they didn't like this book, but actually I quite enjoyed it. I tend not to read reviews before my reading experience. I usually reserve that for after, when I've formed my own opinion. So I've still not actually looked at what it is people didn't like about it. But yeah, like I said, I enjoyed this experience. We basically follow Maiya, who lives in this war-torn Asian empire with her father and her brother who had returned from the war. We see the emperor in need of an imperial tailor, and he comes around and gathers up all of the tailors to come and compete in these trials. It is very important to note that women are not allowed to compete. Maiya, a great seamstress, is determined to go not only to prove herself, but also to help the family. Going and winning and becoming the imperial tailor would mean acclaim for the business, but it would also mean income for her to send back to her family, who are now beginning to starve because her father is old and weak and her brother is injured from the war and I think also probably has PTSD. Disguised as her brother, Maiya goes to compete in these trials, and I think that alone reminded me a lot of Mulan, my favorite Disney movie growing up, which is probably why I like this, because it did have a Mulan meets Project Runway type vibe to it. This is what threw me a little, and maybe threw other people a little, was it essentially felt like two books in one. We have the first part, which I just assumed would be the entire book, where she goes and competes in these trials and kind of makes her way through round after round. But then somewhere in the middle it shifts and we go on a second set of trials. Now it took me a little bit to just adjust to that because it was a little bit jarring, just like changing direction quickly, almost like a little bit of whiplash from it. But once I did, I actually enjoyed the second set of trials a lot more. Another thing that people could have disliked about it, because that's something that I quite disliked about it, was the final, I'd say 10% of this book, because we start to see Maiya make some really silly decisions, and it did feel like decisions made to further the plot instead of decisions that are consistent with her character, and it felt out of place. You kind of question why she did some of the things she did, but in saying that, it leaves us at a point where I am eager to pick up the second book, but not rushing out to get the second book. The final thing I'll say about this is that I really like the dynamic between Maiya and our male main character, Eden, who is the Emperor's sorcerer. I liked his use of magic, even though it is quite sparse. We don't see him use it too often. But still, I liked the sort of mystery surrounding this character. All in all, I think there was a lot of whimsy, almost like a folklore myth type feel to some of the stories in this. And I thought it was just a really fun read. I think if you enjoyed something like The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea, you'll maybe enjoy this one too. Next up, Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. I gave this one a 4-star. And on paper, I feel like this book should have been a 5-star. I should have absolutely loved it. But I think the lack of God killing and gods, because again, that's what the title sold me on, disappointed me slightly. Although this book has 4 POVs, we do mainly follow Kissen, who is a Vega or God killer. And that's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. Not only killing the gods who survive these wars, but also destroying their shrines so that they can't return, because with a shrine they are always able to return. She meets Inna, who is a young girl with a god problem. She also is in need of a little bit of protection for various reasons I won't go into for the sake of not spoiling this. The two of them then meet Elo, who is a knight turned baker. He used to fight in these wars, but now all he wants to do is live a peaceful life where he just bakes some bread. And I'm telling you, my craving for carbs reading this was off the charts, because all Elo did was bake bread and it sounded delicious. But now I'm just thinking about bread, so let's get back on track. The 3 of them are all heading to Midran, and even though they have different quests, they kind of decide, seeing as how we're going in the same direction, we may as well go there together. So they become these really unlikely traveling companions, and I love that. I love the dynamic between the 3 of them. It was a constant like power shift, but also just like the conversations and the banter and the kind of trust that they build is really lovely in this. Like I said, my disappointment really lied in the fact that there wasn't enough gods for my liking. I wanted to be packed with gods from beginning to end. But this book was beautifully written. The world building is really lovely. And when we finally do get to Midran, we start to see more gods. And I love that aspect. And that's why I think I love the sort of final 100 pages more than I did the first part, because now we start to see this really imaginative world where we have gods, we have these different shrines, and I really loved seeing their shrines and what kind of things people sacrificed to these different gods, how the gods themselves manifested and what they could do. Some were really powerful, some weren't at all, and I loved seeing all of that. We started to see things happen a lot more, and it left us in a place where I would be really excited to continue this series. What I did love about it was the quest type fantasy feel it had, almost in a way similar to Lord of the Rings, where, you know, there is a lot of action, but there are also big chunks of the book where people are just traveling, they're just walking, they're just sitting down, making a fire and having like a really cozy dinner together. And like, I love that aspect of it in that way. It almost felt quite cozy, a little bit of an old school fantasy type vibe, instead of the sort of romantasy direction that we seem to be going in with a lot of fantasy. My friends mentioned this reminded them of a D&D campaign. So if you do like that kind of feel, I think you'd really like this. Another 4-star for me was The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. I think it's really important with this to remember that it is a standalone. It doesn't fit in with the Cosmere, because it wouldn't. This has a very different feel than, say, Mistborn or Stormlight Archive. In my mind anyway, Brandon Sanderson's really synonymous with like sweeping fantasy and these big chunky worlds that are so well built and so fully fleshed out. Now this didn't feel as grand in scope because it has far less pages to build the world. It also felt a little bit more silly and sort of humorous. I think something like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy gave me a very similar feel. This does lean a little bit towards sci-fi because there are all these different dimensions and essentially time travel, but you're only really traveling to a dimension. It's all explained in here, hence the name. This character at the beginning of the book has no recollection of who he is, where he is, when he is becomes a question, and he needs to try and puzzle something together. So these memories start to come back to him, and he finds that some of the memories builds a picture of himself that later gets knocked down when he starts to remember more. And what I really liked about that was we kind of go through those motions with him and we kind of discovered things at the same time, which is always really fun. I like feeling included in that journey and not just like I'm reading someone else's story. I also really like that as he kind of starts to put all those puzzle pieces together, he finds himself lacking. And I think it's interesting taking almost like a chosen one type trope and kind of flipping it on its head a bit. He is still meant to be the hero, but he's a very imperfect hero. And I like that. It just made it feel more human. Brandon Sanderson does characterization exceptionally well. He always builds this interesting character that has quirks and flaws and is just someone I am constantly rooting for because they aren't perfect. And I really like that element of this. One thing threw me every now and again was just language. Very important that I clarify this isn't relating to prose. It is still a well-written book. What I mean is we're traveling back to Anglo-Saxon England, trying to make it seem different to what our main character had envisioned medieval England to be. It's just words every now and again and phrases every now and again that you're just expected to kind of catch onto and understand their meaning. And sometimes you could figure it out, but sometimes I was just like, I still don't know what that means. And it isn't relevant, like it isn't important to the story to know because the meaning is implied. But in my brain, I want to understand exactly what I'm reading. And I think that was like a tiny, tiny thing that threw me every now and again. Overall, I think this was a fun read. On to 4.5 reads, and I had 3 this month. My first was Flawless by Elsie Silver. I'm in a reading group aptly named Smut Salon, where we read spicier books. This is our 3rd pick, so the first 2 were Blood Orange and Broken Bonds, which I have spoken about before, and just wasn't my cup of tea. Flawless, on the other hand, I really enjoyed. One of my first notes in our buddy read of this was that it gave me Hallmark movie vibes. Now, obviously, this would be an R-rated Hallmark movie, but I kind of still stick to that because we see Rhett, who is a bull rider. He says some things, he ruffles some feathers, which kind of puts him in a position where he's at risk of losing sponsorship. Sponsorship equals money, so of course our talent agent does not want this to happen. Of course, this talent manager has an extremely good-looking daughter who has just started working at the firm, and she gets assigned to Red to essentially babysit him until the championship and just keep him in line, make sure he doesn't lose any sponsorships. Red doesn't like this at all, not one bit, and he's very unhappy. Sun is kind of trying her best, but I loved seeing that dynamic change from them not really liking each other to liking each other a lot. So I might say liking each other too much for a professional relationship. The thing I really enjoyed about this was that this book could stand without the spice. Often what happens, in my experience anyway, is that books kind of compromise on the quality because they know that people will enjoy reading the schmexy scenes anyway. One of my favorite things in romance is when we do alternate POV and we see one person thinking that they're not good enough or beautiful enough or that they're not worthy of love, and then it flips to the other person thinking that this is the most beautiful person they've seen and that they are so in love with them. And it is just that yearning, especially when two people are unaware of it and they both think that the other person doesn't like them when in fact they really like them. And I love that kind of feel to this book. Summer was a really feisty but likable character. Rhett has some real growth to him, coming to terms with how his family feels about his bull riding and why they are so scared about it. Was a real nice touch. The series continues, not with Rhett and Summer, but there are a few more brothers that they kind of focus on in the following books. Eventually, I think I'd like to circle back around and give those a read because, yeah, I think they're just really heartwarming. They're fun to read. They're real page turners as well. The next 4.5 book is The Woven Kingdom, Tahereh Mafi. And this one was quite strange because I started it on audiobook and I wasn't into it. Luckily, I want to say, my audiobook subscription ran out at about the halfway point and I had to read the back half. And I enjoyed this so much more when I started reading it physically. In this, we have our kingdom, where we have Prince Kamran, our male main character and one of the POVs. And then we also have Eliza, who is a jinn. Very early on, we learn there is a prophecy. And essentially, Eliza cannot live if the king was to survive. Now, you can see how that poses some issues, and you can especially see why Eliza and Prince Kamran might not get along. I also really like the language of this book because a lot of it is in a kingdom and between the king and the prince, or the prince and an advisor. It feels really formal, but it really works for this book. And I think especially then when our prince is quite witty, but witty in a really serious way. It's quite a dry wit. It just really worked, and I just really gravitated towards his character. In the positions that Eliza is serving in to retain her anonymity, she is not meant to be as well spoken and intelligent as she is, and she sometimes finds herself in a bit of trouble because of that. But I like that she had that kind of gusto, and I really liked her personality. So the two of them combined was just magic, and I really enjoyed that dynamic. The thing that kept me from giving this a perfect 5 was just the final bit of this book felt, again, a little bit jarring, like it was changing direction too quickly, and I just couldn't quite catch up and couldn't quite see why it had changed in that direction. Obviously it works, and obviously I will carry on with the second book because I really did enjoy this, and it left us in a place where I have to know what happens next. Beautifully written, it's had beautiful imagery. I'm excited anyway to continue and see what Eliza can do because there is some cool magic at play. So my final 4.5 read for July was 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot. This will be a great spooky season read. In this, we meet Charlie, who unfortunately had died and came back with the ability to see the dead. This is really unfortunate for Charlie, given he lives in York. Now, York is renowned for ghost stories. You can see how that's an issue for Charlie. It's established pretty early on that Charlie has no interest in interacting with these ghosts in any way. He's just keeping his head down, trying to get through his day without being sucked into ghost drama, especially because he's had some bad experiences with these ghosts that we kind of see in flashbacks throughout this book. But we meet someone who lets Charlie know that some of the ghosts have gone missing, and it jolts him into action because I think then he realizes, well, maybe I do have some responsibility. Given that I have this power, maybe I should be figuring out where they've gone. What ensues is a bit of a Sherlock hunt for these ghosts and trying to figure out what exactly happened to them. Also, because he has some friend ghosts, that obviously spurs him on to take action because he wouldn't want anything happening to them. And that's what I really loved about Charlie, is he is so caring and he is such a good friend. He's really compassionate. I loved the relationships Charlie had with everyone. The chemistry between everyone in this book was really nice. There was also one character in this that had me chuckling constantly. I've spoken about how I loved when characters are displaced in time. Now, usually that's when a medieval character is plopped into modern times, and just seeing how they behave with things that we find quite normal is really funny, and that's kind of what happens in this. And I just found it hilarious. So yeah, there's some good laughs in here. I think if you are a fan of something like Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, or the Cassidy Blake series by Victoria Schwab, starting with the City of Ghosts book, you'll probably enjoy this. One other thing Rosie does really well, because I feel like everything's done really well in this, her prose, I think, so beautifully matched the feel of York. York is very gothic. It's got almost like a Victorian-esque feel to it. And I think how she wrote this book really lend itself to the feeling you get walking in York. So I think if you've been to York, you'll appreciate this a lot. But even if you haven't been, this is so vivid and so beautifully written that you'll get that like feel of the city. And York almost in this kind of came alive as a character, even though we don't spend too much time actually on setting. It's just punchy, but like sets you up with a lot of information. I mentioned there were two books that really surprised me. The first was Spice Road by Maiya Ibrahim. This was actually a damaged fairy lead copy that a friend of mine had replaced. So she asked if anyone wanted this, and I put my hand up because it is still really beautiful. So I didn't really know much going into this, and I also didn't really have too many expectations. But this really, really pleasantly surprised me. This is an Arabian inspired setting, again with jinns. So I had quite a few books in similar settings and with similar ideas, but they were very different, and I've enjoyed both. We have Amani, who is a shield. She uses her magic to safeguard her city and to also keep the ghouls that kind of wander the desert around the city at bay. The magic system in this was really cool because we have tea magic. I always like when there's limits on magic. In this case, you drink your tea every morning, for example, and you have the whole day to use your magic. But once that runs out, you are without magic until you perform the tea ceremony again. I like not only that it is limited and that it is a cool and unique magic system, but also that it really fit with the setting of this. Imani can be a frustrating character when you first begin reading this book because she is quite small-minded. We learn that there are obviously neighboring cities, but Imani has no interest in learning about them or protecting them in any way because she just feels like she was given her magic to protect her people and fight the monsters around her city, and nothing else matters. And I think Amani's growth in this is something that I really liked. In a sense, this book did feel like a bit of a character study because we see Amani going through all of these things on her journey and really changing her opinion. And I love that about her. I love character growth. Amani, also known as the Jinni Killer, stumbles upon a Jinni, and he clues her in that her brother, who she thought dead, might not be dead. So we're going on this quest to track down Amani's brother. Because she cannot do so alone, she is sent with a group of other shields, and of course one of the shields is Imani's rival. And I love the way that their relationship changes, and not necessarily in the way you expect it to change. So I really like that. I also liked the forbidden element in Imani, the Jinni Killer, conversing with a Jinni. A lot of relationships in here that I really enjoyed, especially also Amani and her little sister. I like the world building of this. I liked their journey. Their quest was really good. But most of all, I liked Amani's growth, and I'm really, really intrigued to see how this series continues. The only thing that kept me from giving this a full 5 stars was some of the internal dialogue became a tiny bit repetitive. I think it's a huge issue. It was just like a tiny thing, if I'm being extremely nitpicky, which I clearly am. I would actually really recommend this. I think it offers something a little bit unique to some of the other romantasy books I've read recently. And I think it's just because the key ingredient here is really dynamic characters. They're very layered. Almost all of them are really flawed too, and I enjoy characters that aren't perfect. I think it's easy to write a character who's incredibly good looking and incredibly strong and skilled, but like I think with this, it just felt a little bit different, a little bit fresh, and I really liked it. Second book that really took me by surprise this month, Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. This book I read as part of our round robin, and we all get to annotate each other's copies, which is really fun. I really like that idea. I went into this with a little bit of trepidation because I knew this was quite heavily focused on mental illness. I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy it, if it was going to trigger me. And I will say, please, before you read this, make sure you're in an okay frame of mind, because we do see our main character really go through highs and lows, and that can be triggering. So just make sure you're feeling okay before you dive into this. In this book, we meet Gilda, and we very quickly establish that she has acute anxiety and depression, and she has this people-pleasing streak where she just is unable to say no. And I think a lot of that obviously comes with anxiety, the fact that she doesn't want to upset anyone. And I think she finds it easier to just say yes and go along with things instead of actually standing her ground. Because she is so eager to just keep saying yes, Gilda finds herself in very interesting and compromising situations, and she goes on this insane journey that was not only ridiculous, but it was laugh out loud funny. Some of the things that happens to Gilda in this is just, I couldn't stop chuckling. This is stream of consciousness, so we are literally in Gilda's head and experiencing whatever she's thinking. And I think the way that this was structured in sort of short paragraphs really shows you the turmoil. You can really see when Gilda's hitting a real low, when she's kind of coming back out of that. And I really love that. I thought it was a real roller coaster ride, which I think anxiety and depression and ill mental health is. It's just these highs and lows, and you can really see that in the narrative style here. This also reminded me a lot of Fleabag, and in that stream of consciousness manner. What kept me from giving this 5 stars was Gilda is extremely frustrating sometimes. Sometimes you literally want to take her by the shoulders and just shake her and just say, stop saying yes. Please just say no. And she does not do that. This was also really heartwarming. I really liked the way Gilda thinks. She just is constantly trying her best. This was also such a realistic portrayal of mental health treatment, like how difficult it is to be taken seriously. Some of this really spoke to me. There's so many parts of it that did feel really relevant. This novel moved me. It made me laugh. It made me cry. I was just really wanting to wrap Gilda up and just give her a big hug and tell her things will be okay. And I think very, very slowly throughout the course of this novel, we do see things improve for her. Even though there isn't a huge arc and there isn't a satisfying, everything worked out okay message at the end of it, I think that's what makes this book good. It's an accurate portrayal, because we know that anxiety and depression isn't curable. It's not something that's ever going to go away. It's something that if properly managed, that you can live with. It just encapsulated that, and I think in that way it is a bit of a slice of life novel. I really like this, and I feel like it is hard to actually accurately talk about it without giving anything away, but I really urge you, if you like Fleabag, absolutely read this. But also if you just want something that is oddly comforting, I think, especially if you deal with anxiety and mental illness, to see some parts of yourself represented in this. And that is every single book I read in July, wrapped and reviewed. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would appreciate that. Also, give it a thumbs up if you don't mind. In my description, you'll find links to everything from social media to ways to support the channel and much more. In the meantime, I would love to hear from you. If you've read any of those books, let me know, and let me know if you have a favorite, if there's anything that you would like to pick up. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will see you next time.